Unlike Britain, unlike countries in Europe, unlike countries in Asia or Latin America or Africa, Canada, since the time of its dominion in 1867, has never had its sovereignty threatened.
So, Canada goes to the polls today to elect a new parliament and its next prime minister. And it's a contest which has been turned on its head by Donald Trump and his belligerent approach to the US's northern neighbour. Well, Shachi Kurl is a pollster and president of the Angus Reid Institute, and she joins me now. Shachi, thanks for being with us.
Hugo, thanks for having me. Really appreciate the opportunity.
No, look, a pleasure to have you on. Just a few months ago, it looked like a fourth term for the Liberals, led then by Justin Trudeau, but now led by Mark Carney. A fourth term looked impossible. Explain to us how big an upset there's been in Canadian politics.
Well, I think you've set it up very well. Consider that on December 31st of last year, New Year's Eve 2024, the Liberals had hit a historical floor in their vote intention support. They were down to 16%. That's 1-6. The Prime Minister himself, at the time, Justin Trudeau, his approval levels had hit an all-time low. And this was at the end of 9 years, two elections in 2019 and 2021, where not only had the governing Liberals lost the popular vote, they'd had to enter into agreements in Parliament in order to hold power. And it was really feeling at that point like the wheels were coming off the bus. That poll, incidentally, it was ours. And I remember that feeling when I sort of hit the send button to publish it. It was like, I have a feeling I know what this is going to end up doing. And sure enough, within a week, Justin Trudeau had announced his resignation. Those polling numbers combined with just so much baggage, so much scandal, and just an inability at that time to be able to meet or beat the Conservatives in the polls led to an untenable situation for Trudeau. But I often talk about the cruelty of timing, because within 2 weeks of that announcement, Donald Trump had been inaugurated as president. He immediately starts making comments and threats around annexing Canada, making Canada the 51st state. And just to underscore how extreme that is in the psyche and the minds of Canadians, unlike Britain, unlike countries in Europe, unlike countries in Asia or Latin America or Africa, Canada, since the time of its dominion in 1867, has never had its sovereignty threatened, has never had its borders threatened. So this wasn't just like, haha, it's Trump and he's trolling. The more he said it, the more Canadians started to really internalize that. So that was a huge factor. It lifted Canadians into a place of a unified nationalism. You know, you saw the phrases and the signs, elbows up, or Canada is not for sale. And in that moment, Justin Trudeau really met the moment, if you will. He was eloquent. He was sort of at his best in that moment of crisis, as were many of Canada's, we are a federation, many of Canada's premiers. The person who was quite silent around all of this was Pierre Poilievre, leader of the opposition, continuing to campaign and talk about consumer carbon pricing or taxation or these types of issues. And so that, to me, was the beginning of a sign that the center-left in this country, and Canada is mostly center-left in the way it thinks, was starting to coalesce again under the Liberals. The departure of Trudeau combined with the Trump factor really breathed new life into the Liberals, but at a speed that has been breathtaking.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's obvious even from over here. Look, Pierre Poilievre, you mentioned, the Conservative leader, he had been looking strong before pre-Trump because he was promising to help with the fundamentals, you know, the dollar in people's pockets and so on. Is he being penalized for his silence over Donald Trump, or is there an explicit reason why people don't trust him to stand up to Donald Trump?
There have been challenges throughout Poilievre's leadership of the Conservative Party. So, you know, his own base, the Conservative base, love him. They're fired up by him. They like the flinty rhetoric. They like the tone, which is an edgy tone. You know, his critics try to compare him to Trump, call him a mini Trump. From a policy fundamental perspective, I don't agree with that. Trump is virulently anti-immigration. Poilievre is very pro-immigration. Trump is anti-abortion, or at least, you know, is that from a policy perspective in order to win votes. Poilievre is on the record saying he's pro-choice. So, you know, on the fundamentals, I would not say that's the case, but Poilievre has played footsie with a lot of hard right, anti woke advocates and activists. Think, he did a long interview with Jordan Peterson. He's never sat down to do long interviews with any of the mainstream Canadian news organizations, private or the public broadcaster. But he sat and made time for Jordan Peterson in a country, even though Jordan Peterson is Canadian, in a country that doesn't have the best view of him. That certainly makes an impression. So, as you know, these things are never in a vacuum. It was never Justin Trudeau or not Justin Trudeau. It was never just Pierre Poilievre or not Pierre Poilievre. It was Poilievre versus Trudeau. In that matchup, Canadians were quite tired of Trudeau and quite tired of promises unkept or over-promising and under-delivering on a lot of those fundamental issues: housing affordability, cost of living, inflation. But in the face of Mark Carney coming in as leader, someone who had been Governor of the Bank of England, someone who had been Governor of the Bank of Canada, somebody who seemed to have in his persona a very boring, policy wonkish, technocratic approach. This was, I think, Canadians in that moment were looking for somebody who was prepared to take a calmer, more stable stance. They've been prepared to lean in very heavily on the things that they think Mark Carney can do. And of course, he's a political neophyte. That is the risk. But when you look and ask Canadians, which of these two leaders would be best on various issues, best as prime minister, best on the economy, best on reducing inflation, best on housing affordability, Carney seems to win on almost every category. Canadians know very little about him, but they are prepared to put that trust in him based on what they do know.
I mean, over here, Mark Carney is seen as the technocrat's technocrat. If he has a flaw, he's regarded as being too establishment, too insider, quite boring. How's he seen in Canada? Does that view sort of cross the pond, or is there, or I mean, do people have more excitement about him?
No, in fact, when we asked Canadians in some recent polling to use words to describe the two leaders, the words that were most described to Mark Carney included influential, strong, competent, up to the job, smart, but also dull and boring. They were right up there. But I think in this election, after 9 years of a very flamboyant Justin Trudeau, after 2 years in opposition of Pierre Poilievre, whose approach I would not suggest is boring. He does have a very pointy tone to him, and his supporters absolutely love that. But I think many Canadians, and especially in the face of Trump, are looking perhaps for a calmer voice. At least that's what the polling is telling us.
Shachi, I've got to ask, you're in Vancouver, and we all know there was a terrible attack in Vancouver on Saturday with multiple fatalities. We're still hearing more about that. It sounds horrendous, and you have our sympathies at such a horrible time. What's the mood like in the city, and what impact is that likely to have on the campaign?
Hugo, at least 11 have died. We don't know if that's going to be the final number. Nothing like this has ever happened in our city before. It was a driver who drove into a crowd. I want to be explicit in saying at this time, police do not believe this was either domestic or international terrorism. They don't know what caused it, but they don't seem to be going in that direction. But our hearts are broken. It was young people and families gathered at a cultural festival, having fun. It was a beautiful day on Saturday in Vancouver. The sun was shining, which, you're in London, you know how rare that is for a spring day. And to end like this has been devastating. Our hearts are broken and we're looking for answers. But the other thing I would say from practical terms is it has had an impact. It did have an impact on the last day, the last full day of the campaign. To the point where there were still questions early on as to whether or not Mark Carney and the Liberals, who have actually been eclipsed a little bit in British Columbia, which is the province where Vancouver is, by the Conservatives, had been planning to make a campaign stop in the city. And I think that was still being sorted out as of Sunday morning. So it's been the real life and tragedy always will trump politics, but it's actually had an impact on the last day of the campaign.
Yeah, I'm sure it has. Look, on the assumption that Carney is the next leader, and we have to assume, well, remains as leader indeed after the election, the problems the Liberals had in the past aren't going to have just disappeared.
No.
Is politics for the next few years just going to be about Donald Trump?
It certainly feels in some ways that it is, doesn't it? And I mean, I think we've all, perhaps we, the collective we in the world that aren't Trump supporters or Trump voters, we'll put it that way, tend to forget how chaotic life under Trump can be. So it hasn't even been 100 days. The first 100 days of Trump back in 2016, I'm sure were as chaotic, but I think we have a tendency to forget things in the fullness of time in history. Will it be entirely defined by Trump? Sure, maybe. Who knows? But I think the thing for Canada is domestically. There's two big points: one domestically, and then one multilaterally, or in terms of Canada on the world stage. Domestically, Canadians have written, if we do see Mark Carney prevail, Canadians will have written one of the biggest, blankest checks to Mark Carney in handing the Liberals a fourth term, particularly in the event of a majority government. So it's a big bet that Canadians will have taken on Carney, and the issues, cost of living, the tariffs, the plant closures in auto manufacturing, et cetera. Those problems won't go away, and Canadians will then be pivoting to looking to this government for some fixes and for some answers, and for relief. So the pressure will be on the Liberals in that scenario. It also represents, however, because of Carney's time abroad, an opportunity for Canada to sort of reset in terms of its international relationships. Canada is generally pretty much an afterthought in Europe, an afterthought in Britain. I know that. I've spent time in both those parts of the world. It's not like Canada's disliked, but it's not necessarily taken as seriously as it could or should be as a trading partner, as an economic partner or ally. Asia's making moves now in the face of everything that's happening with Trump and China. But of course, Canada in the last 8 years has suffered from really, and it's not Canada's fault, but bilateral relations between Canada and China could not be worse. Bilateral relations between Canada and India, owing to some domestic politics issues in Canada and support among all parties with the elements of Khalistani supporters who also have influence in the Conservative Party, in the Liberal Party. That has been a bête noire for New Delhi, absolutely. And of course, Canada has its own beefs, believing that Delhi sent somebody to kill a Canadian citizen on sovereign soil. So there are some big messes to be cleaned up. Canada, under Carney, has an opportunity to enhance and bolsters Canada's place in the world, to make the case that Canada can be a provider of natural resources and other critical exports. But at the end of the day, again, the pressure will be on, especially in the face of trying to reframe Canada's place in the world as not being so dependent on the United States, which is a big pivot.
Finally, Shachi, explain for us what elbows up means, because we've heard Mark Carney say it a lot, and it slightly falls on befuddled ears over here, I'm not going to lie.
Well, yes, I'm talking to somebody in a country where they still refer to hockey as ice hockey, which I think is like, hockey is hockey. Of course it's played on the ice.
We have another hockey.
Yeah, we know about your hockey. We call that grass hockey or field hockey.
What is it? It's a defensive move.
It's when you're playing hockey, I don't play hockey, but when you're on the ice, it's you keep your elbows up, right? Like you're trying to, it's a defensive move on the ice, on the skates. Hockey is a very physical game, and it's that posture of we're ready to fight. Let's go, right? Elbows up. I don't know if you can see that on camera.
Elbows up. Shachi Kurl, thank you very much indeed. Great pleasure to speak to you.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.